All right, everyone. There's the first bit we need to edit out.
Mm-hmm.
All right, thanks for joining us for this virtual session on the first virtual version of DrupalCon. I appreciate you taking the time to join us for this session, and hopefully next time we see you all, we'll be face-to-face at a future DrupalCon. So as you know, we're here today to talk about a case study of using embedded Angular within Drupal as part of a project that we did for the University of Toronto, specifically their School of Continuing Studies. My name is Martin Anderson-Klutz. In the project that we're talking about, I was the Drupal Solutions Lead, and if you want to contact me, you can find me on drupal.org as Manclue, and I'm joined by Dylan Reeder.
Hello, everyone. So on this project, I was the technical lead, so just around the implementation and development of some of the custom modules that we'll be talking about.
And you can reach Dylan on drupal.org as dreeder. So let's begin by talking about the opportunity. Here's a look at the architecture of the previous website. So you can see that the school was using some software called DestinyOne that really managed their course information and a few related pieces. To extend that data management capability, they built their own middleware they called MIMR, and that really fed data into an Angular application that they had sitting on top of a WordPress site. Now, because of the way all of these pieces work together, specifically the fact that Angular and WordPress didn't actually share data between the two, the different courses and other academic information didn't really have their own URLs. And so as a consequence, they couldn't really be crawled properly by search engines or shared on social platforms. And it also meant that it was difficult to link between related content. And the search was really implemented within Angular, which meant that it was only able to search that academic information. So it was really just courses and people who were looking for information maybe around tuition or other pieces that were really information managed by WordPress, weren't things that people could find within that site search. And then the final pain point was really that any of the data that was updated in some of the upstream systems, so for example, MIMR or DestinyOne, would have a delay before they would actually be reflected on the live website, potentially up to 4 hours. Now, for anyone who's not familiar with some of these pieces that we've talked about, we thought it would be worth just diving in and giving a little bit more explanation. So for anyone not familiar with Angular, it's a TypeScript-based web application framework, which is another way of saying that it's really an enhanced version of what we would be familiar with as JavaScript. It was developed by Drupal or by Google, and so it's open source. And it uses a hierarchy of components to provide dynamic views through what's called asynchronous template compilations, which is a pretty sort of technical description, so I thought it might be helpful to show a diagram of how these different pieces work. So within your Angular application, you would have templates essentially within your HTML. Those would have Angular components, which have injector services running to feed data in. The components get recompiled and injected into those templates within the page. So the end result is a very dynamic, sort of app-like feel, and that's why Angular is really popular for, dynamic and in some cases sort of headless Drupal type applications. Now, DestinyOne, as we mentioned, is the piece that the School of Continuing Studies was using for managing course and related information. And the makers of DestinyOne describe it as student lifecycle management software. So it's really purpose-built for use by continuing education schools, both within University of Toronto and really for lots of different higher ed institutions. And within the overall architecture or I guess information architecture of the school, it's really the source of truth for course information and some of the related pieces like enrollment and availability of particular sections. It does offer a web interface, but the people that we've talked to that have worked with it have said that it's difficult to sort of theme and look like a modern web interface. And it does offer some APIs, but a limited range of them. And so that's part of the reason why the School of Continuing Studies decided to go ahead and build that custom middleware piece to really give them a lot more flexibility in terms of what fields were managed for things like courses and sections, as well as to be able to manage related things like, instructors and some of their, biography information. So MIMR now becomes the place where the School of Continuing Studies really manages that, I would say, superset of information, and also gives them a lot more flexibility in terms of how that data is exposed. So previously how it was ingested by Angular as it sat on top of their WordPress site, but as they worked with us on the new Drupal-based website, gave them a lot more control in terms of what data could be exposed and so on. And thought it would be helpful to also talk about, we're going to be using a lot of terminology that's really specific to sort of higher ed, and in some cases potentially more for higher ed continuing education programs. So I thought it would be helpful to sort of diagram out quickly how some of these things relate to each other. So programs being kind of a superset of a variety of different courses that people can take. Within each course, there will be a variety of sections that will be taught by different instructors. And then programs are sometimes associated with different associations who may award certificates or designations for successful completion of either programs or courses. So hopefully, as we start to throw around some of this terminology, this little diagram will give you a better sense of how those pieces fit together. So let's talk about the solution that we built for them based on Drupal. Here's a high-level architecture, so you can see it's similar to the degree that there's still DestinyOne as the primary source of truth, particularly for courses and some of those related pieces. Still using the middleware piece, MIMR, but the piece that we built for them is really Drupal 8 with some embedded Angular pieces, and then using Solr to provide sort of enterprise-grade search results. One of the primary differences is, in this case, the data being produced by MIMR is not ingested solely by the Angular application, but also to some degree by both Drupal and Solr. And so that provides advantages like having distinct URLs for all the different content, which means that it can be sort of indexed and shared properly. Allows us to interlink between things. So from a user standpoint, it makes it a lot more intuitive. And the site search is able to index not just the academic information, but really all of the content that's available within the website, and in some cases beyond that. And then we're also able to build some custom drush commands so that if they did some data updates within MIMR, they could trigger an update to make sure that that gets populated live to the website immediately. As we were working on the website, we were working in partnership with their team, and they were making some updates to the MIMR application itself. So updating the data export for things like courses, certificates, and instructors, but also adding additional exports so that things like programs, associations, and designations, even though they were going to be displayed within the website, could be managed within MIMR, because really they wanted that to be where a lot of that really academic-focused information was being managed. And then they also added their own triggers for those grep strips directly within MIMR, so that as they update data, they can easily, without having to go to the command line, be able to trigger that website refresh. So if you want to take a look at the website, by all means go to learn.utoronto.ca, but we'll just walk through it very quickly here. As you can see, the end result, very clean and modern, lots of use of photography, even for things like navigation, and they wanted to make sure that the search was nice and prominent, even on the homepage, to really help people quickly connect to the information they were looking for. But since we're here to talk about how Drupal and Angular can talk together, let's look at a course page which has some good examples of kind of the combination of different information, either managed within Drupal or, especially for things like courses, being the primary source of truth for a lot of the course information. So in this example here, the picture that we're seeing would be managed within Drupal, but really more of the data and text is really coming from MIMR. So the course details we can see in the sidebar here is all directly pulled from data managed by MIMR, and really is never within the Drupal database whatsoever. As we go down the page, we can see some other examples of this. And then further down the page is an example of where we can start to see the opportunity of using Angular to really provide that app-like experience directly within the web page. So as a prospective student, you can go through, you can navigate different sections offered for a particular course. You can see things like who the instructor is for that particular section, the times and dates, potentially even filter on different criteria and so on. So it really gives you the opportunity to have a much richer experience without having to go off to different pages to find that relevant information. So now to talk about the implementation, how we got there, I'm going to hand you over to Dylan.
All right, hi everyone again. So like Martin mentioned, we basically, when we were developing, had to find a way to properly pull in all of this information coming in from MIMR into Drupal. So the solution we ended up coming up with is what we call a MIMR Stub. So basically, we used both taxonomy and content types. We just created a series of entities that would represent content stored within MIMR. The reason we call these stubs is because basically the information we're actually passing it from MIMR is very minimal, because we basically don't want to have editors going back and forth between the Drupal site and MIMR to have to update information. So really, when it comes to what it actually gets from MIMR itself, it only actually gets a couple of things, which is the external MIMR ID, the title of the stub, which serves as the title of the entity, and any entity references to other stubs that exist within the site. Now, because we're dealing with relational data that doesn't exist on Drupal, for each stub to figure out this relationship, it's actually done through a hook entity pre-save, where basically it runs a query to find existing MIMR IDs within Drupal and then link those two entities together. So now that we've kind of laid out the architecture of the MIMR stub itself, the next thing comes into, okay, what kind of information are we actually receiving from MIMR? Sorry, Martin, we're gonna have to re-edit this. You mind if we go back? Okay, gonna start again. 3, 2, 1. So our implementation ended up solving, oh my God. Got in my own head, sorry. Okay. Whew. Okay, I'm just gonna jump back. Okay, so thank you, Martin, for the handoff. So basically, when it comes to the implementation itself, we had a couple of challenges to overcome. The first one being, okay, now that we're getting information from MIMR into Drupal, how do we actually store that? So the solution we ended up coming up with is what we call a MIMR Stub. So these are both taxonomy and content types. We created a series of entities between both of those types to create content that is just stored within MIMR. The reason we're calling it a stub is because it actually only receives a very small amount of information from MIMR itself, and that is the external MIMR ID, the title of the stub, which we use as the title of the entity, and any entity references to other stubs. Now, because it's relational data that isn't actually stored on Drupal, for each stub, whenever we save it, we do have to do a hook entity pre-process to run a query that can find existing external MIMR IDs that are stored within Drupal to kind of link those together. So like Martin had mentioned before, one of the advantages of implementing stubs, we're able to leverage the full potential of Drupal as a content management system while ensuring we aren't causing site editors to have to jump back and forth between MIMR and Drupal itself. It also allows us to add additional fields, like you had saw on the course example of, we can basically add stuff like photography or imagery without having to jump back and forth. And what's worth noting is for vital fields that are actually being imported by MIMR, we actually end up hiding them in the form display to prevent any potential tampering from editors themselves. So now that we've kind of talked about how the structure of a MIMR stub is set up, we need to talk about, okay, what kind of stuff are we actually getting from MIMR itself? So the way that MIMR actually interacts with the Drupal 8 site is through JSON files sent to a variety of directories stored within the site. For each type of content or entity we're creating, we are given basically two types of files: a overall import JSON feed file that represents all entities of that type, and for each of those entities, a individual entity JSON file. So to kind of just give you a quick example, this is a quick look at basically what you would see for the programs. So you can see basically it is just a pretty simple array of IDs, names, when it was last updated, and if it falls within a certain branch of the site. But then if we look at an example a little more in depth, this would be an individual JSON file that is a lot more organized and has a lot more information about each specific entity that we're taking a look at. So this kind of breaks down the parents, the certificates, the categories, the courses associated with it, and again, its update time, which is used for our import, which comes up next. So now that we've kind of, have the structure of the stubs and we know what kind of information we were receiving from MIMR, the next big step was, of course, to actually get it onto the site. So the way we did that is through MIMR import. So this was a custom module that we developed that does the following. It's based off a queue processor that for each entity type, it compares existing content within the site from the JSON feed provided through that file. And basically it'll do the following. If a JSON item doesn't exist within the site, it creates a new entity of that type. If an entity doesn't appear within this JSON list but exists on the Drupal site, we delete it. And if the JSON item has been updated within the last 4 hours, we update that entity. So that was kind of a brief overview of kind of how we imported it. It was a very technical piece that we could definitely talk about more, but that's not why we're here. Really why we're here, though, is to talk about the MIMR Angular module. So this is the custom module we developed that contains the entire Angular application and library that's used throughout the site. So I figured the first thing that's important to talk about is its structure itself. So just because it's like a regular custom module, we build it in the traditional sense where we have a .info file, a .libraries, and a .module file. We also, of course, have an SRC folder, which places what we call Angular blocks on the site, which can be used for typical block placement. And we also have the app folder, where we store the entire AngularJS application that we're running itself. So I kind of wanted to first jump into the MIMR Angulars.libraries because this was kind of the most important part of getting the Angular up and running across the site. So basically, within this library file, we defined the following. So AngularJS, which is just a remote call to AngularJS minified script hosted by Google. After that, we then defined the U of T School of Continuing Studies application, which is the main Angular application and requires AngularJS for it to run. And then on top of that, we also run a component library for each entity type that has data stored within the MIMR files and is going to be using Angular on the site. And this requires the U of T app. And the reason we kind of break it out so much is each of these would contain special functions that are specific only to this content type. And then, so now that we've kind of defined it and we have the JavaScript running, now we need to actually place this information onto the site. So the way we do that is through MIMR Angular blocks. So to work with a Drupal theme, we created a series of blocks with theme overrides that point to Angular templates stored within the /templates folder of this module. Placed within, we then place these via a standard Drupal block layout, and we set it only to show on these entities that come from MIMR. So quickly, we just have a quick example here of what one of these MIMR Angular block templates would look like. So this is for available certificates within a course. So basically, you can see it's kind of a mismatch of Twig and a bit of Angular. The thing I really want to draw attention to is the verbatim tag, and that'll kind of be discussed a little later on. But that was kind of the key to how everything really works when these two are working together. So now that we have an example of that template, this is what it actually looks like in functionality, where basically it's able to load the individual JSON file and take a look and list out all of the available certificates listed on the site. I also wanted to just call attention to, as Martin mentioned, because the way Angular works, we're actually also able to make a very in-depth small applications within the site itself. So as an example, this for a program is the search courses available to it, which allows for stuff like filtering and basically a lot of really helpful ways of helping the users get around the site. So kind of like I had mentioned before, a major issue that does present itself when we're designing an Angular JS template within a Drupal theme is that Twig itself and Angular both use the curly bracket syntax for processing. This is why the verbatim tag is critical, as it allows for the embedding of it within a Twig template, because the verbatim tag will basically ignore any templating done within that tag. So that way we're kind of able to let Twig do its thing while Angular runs on top of it. So kind of now that we've made these blocks and now they're placed on this site, the next question becomes, how do we actually redirect to related information? So the big problem was with this implementation, we have a lot of offsite relational data, but we need to ensure that links are able to properly redirect to the corresponding Drupal URL when only given an external MIMR ID within the template. But because of that, we don't actually know what the actual URL of the Drupal on the Drupal site is. So what we created was the MIMR redirect module. And basically, just to kind of break it down, its logic is fairly simple. It consists of a controller that designates different routes depending on the context of the MIMR stub being referenced. So as an example, here you can see we have a link of MIMR redirect /course /26097805. So this is a reference to a course stored in MIMR with an ID of 26097805. So basically what the controller does is it goes to that link, and then it will do an entity search, try and find an entity that contains this MIMR ID that is a course, and then redirect to it immediately. So that's just kind of a quick way of how we were able to actually leverage it to be able to link within Drupal itself. But then on top of that, we could also do more with it thanks to the ability of implementing stuff like Solar. So for that, I'm actually going to hand it back over to Martin for the implementation done there.
Thanks, Dylan. As we mentioned earlier on, one of the challenges that we had in the previous application was the search that was written in Angular could only provide search results that were that academic information, specifically courses in the previous site. And we really wanted the new site to give users the ability to search not just within the course information, but really all of the information that was being presented within the website. And then on top of that, the School of Continuing Studies requested that users also be able to get search results from their Zendesk application, which was really providing kind of an FAQ style database. Now, one of the things that we realized is that thanks to the stub content that Dylan had already talked about, we could effectively have Drupal go through and use its sort of standard search API indexing to go through all of the content. And then we wrote a custom search processor so that whenever it got to an entity that's really a stub for MIMR managed content, what it would do is it would actually go into that file structure that Dylan had talked about where all of the detailed data resides, retrieve all of that, and then effectively convert that into a format that Solar could use for indexing. And then on top of that, we wrote additional custom fields for any pieces that we knew wanted to be managed or provided as facets within the search. And so using this approach, and again, thanks to the fact that we had those stubs available, it actually became fairly simple to be able to get all of that JSON data that really never was part of the Drupal database indexed and into Solar so that it could really be effectively used for search. So here's an example of how that various types of data, we really wanted to provide it in more of a structured, some would say bento box style approach to help users make sense of the different types of information that they're seeing as part of their search results. And so you can see the primary search experience that the school wanted to prioritize and make sure that people could find most easily was still sort of course and program search results. So that's the first thing that you see on the page, and really the facets on the left-hand side are really about helping people to navigate within that. But then on the right-hand side, we have a set of relevant results from their FAQ database. So that's, again, being pulled from Zendesk via their API. And then if we go further down the page, we can see related content search results, which for the most part is really that extra data that's residing and managed within Drupal. So now that we've talked about what we built and how we built it, let's talk about some of the things that we learned along the way. So specifically, Drupal and Angular can be a very effective pairing in terms of allowing each of those technologies to work together, and also when and how to leverage each one of them for sort of their own strengths. So Drupal for managing a lot of those complex relationships and providing those in a very web compliant way. And then Angular for providing more of that app-like functionality and you know, as Dylan showed, the search within the programs page, or as we saw, the section search within the course page. Another piece that was interesting about this particular project is, as much as we had our own digital echidna development team, we were also working very closely in partnership with the development team from the School of Continuing Studies, and it wouldn't have been the success that it was without a really strong collaboration. And so having timely and ongoing communication was really key, and we even had members of their team in our Slack channel so that we could really have that real-time dialogue and get questions answered as we needed. Since the site has gone live, we've actually handed the site over to that development team from the U of T Continuing Studies School, and they've actually been able to take the site and do some ongoing improvements. So some examples of things that they've been able to do with the site since taking it over from us include using some of that MIMR data in custom tokens so that they could do things like populate meta tags using MIMR data. Also providing extended breadcrumb functionality, again, using MIMR managed content. And then they've taken some of the additional things like courses and added the new flag that you might have noticed earlier on in the one search screen that Dylan showed, or having approximate course hours so that people can understand what kind of a time commitment they're getting into. They've also been able to do things like provide expanded display of connected data. So for example, on a section listing, you can see a lot better instructor information. And similarly, on an instructor page, you can see a list of the courses that they teach. And so again, providing a lot better context in terms of how these different pieces relate to each other. We also thought it would be interesting, because one of the primary developers within the School of Continuing Studies really comes from more of a WordPress background, to get her feedback on what it was like to work with Drupal. So she shared some thoughts, including the fact that she was impressed with the flexibility of Drupal, particularly for things like modeling content types and taxonomy, but did find the admin UI was somewhat less intuitive, particularly for things like media management. But that being said, this site having been built a couple of years ago now, was really before Media Library was stable and core, and some of the advancements around the admin theme like we're seeing in Claro. So I feel like if we were to build this site again today, we could probably provide a more intuitive experience and you know, soften some of those pain points. So that's really what we've prepared for you, and we definitely thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation. Definitely would like to keep the dialogue going, and so by all means, either comment on the section directly within the DrupalCon site, or you can also reach out to us via our contact forms on Drupal.org, and we hope to talk to you soon.
Yep. Thank you guys so much.